Hello, I'm Dr. Kaye Whitehead, and I'm joined now by Reverend Nontombi Naomi Tutu, educator and human rights activist. Reverend Tutu founded the Tutu Foundation for Development and Relief and served as chairperson from 1985 to 1990. As you've probably gathered from her last name, Reverend Tutu is the daughter of Bishop Desmond Tutu. She also selected the writings for and wrote the introduction to the book, The Words of Desmond Tutu. Reverend Tutu, it is an honor and a privilege to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Let me begin by saying I saw your father speak. He spoke at my college graduation from Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. And watching him on that stage, he inspired us, not just to go out and change the world, but to do it with love and with grace and with humility. And as a pastor's daughter, similar to you, my dad's a bishop now, there's something about hearing someone who knows the word speak about love and grace and humility. Can you talk about how your father's words have influenced your path?
Yes. Well, I mean, I think it's influenced my path in a couple of contradictory ways, if you like. So the one is that I early decided that I would never be an ordained clergy person. So very early in my life, I knew that I looked a lot like my father. That was like my birth story, was how much I looked like my father. And so very early decided that, I can't look like him and then also follow in his footsteps. So I knew that ordained ministry was not going to be the path that I followed. So in that way, the influence was that it took me until my 50s to go to seminary and finally accept the call to ordained ministry. But the other is, I think that just in the experience of growing up with my parents, that they very much instilled in us the two things that I always tell people is that from our African and our Christian background. So from our African background, the idea of Ubuntu, the idea that we are all connected and that our place in the world is based on our relationships with others, and that to have Ubuntu means that you have respect for other people. And so very, very much growing up in that kind of atmosphere where our actions and our words were listened to by my parents and played back to us in terms of, did that sound like something that comes from a place of Ubuntu or not? And then with, being Christian, again, that the fundamental lesson I think that our parents taught us was the importance of recognizing the imago Dei in every human being, recognizing that every person put on this planet is made in the image of God and therefore worthy of respect, of care, of and they started it with us, as siblings, that this is how you're meant to treat your siblings, which are the hardest people to treat with respect very often. The people that you're fighting over the last piece of chicken, or who's getting into the bathroom first and who's taking forever. And so those are the people that, in fact, my parents started the lessons of, your siblings are made in God's image. And if you can come to recognize God's image in your siblings, that will help you to recognize God's image in others around you. And so that has been like the lessons that we heard over and over, to the point sometimes they're just like, oh my God, not again the image of God, or not again Ubuntu, give me a break, Sometimes I want to not like people and not have to be respectful and but always, because of being surrounded by it so much, always that came back to us. And I think that that is the central teaching that that I got from my parents.
Now, I know that your mother also was very influential in your life, that she really helped to shape you. When you think about the contributions of both your parents, I mean, you're having this international figure as your father, having his path before you. How did the two of them kind of help to hone what I would say is not just your skill, but actually being able to hear the calling that you received?
So my parents were very much a team. You know, they from I mean I can from when I can remember that it's always been. Funnily enough, I preached at their 60th wedding anniversary about 6-7 years ago, and I said, you know, that anybody who knew my parents, it didn't matter what they called them. So, you know, it was always for us, it was Ma and Daddy. My cousins, it was always Malume and Mazi. So I mean, they always went together. The students that my parents taught, it was always Ndate Tutu and Auslia. So they always went together. And so for me, what I got from them was that each of them had specific gifts that they brought into their relationship and therefore into their raising of us as their children. And my mother was definitely the disciplinarian, was definitely the one who would tell you, no, you have not lived up to what we expected of you, and did not mince her words in letting you know that you had failed or you had misbehaved or you had embarrassed them. My father was much more the one who would talk to you very quietly, and often his words were less often in anger and more in talking about disappointment if you did not live up to what they hoped for you to be. But one of the things that they were very clear to us growing up was that each of us was gifted, and they recognized that each of us was gifted in different ways, that they didn't expect us as their children to be carbon copies of them or even to be carbon copies of one another, that each of us came, I mean, I think that the greatest gift that they gave us was this sense that they didn't expect us to be little Desmonds or little Leahs, nor did they expect that out of the four of us, we would all be exactly alike. That they recognized that we each came with gifts and we each came with weaknesses, right? That each of us had separate weaknesses and separate strengths, and that they encouraged us, both of them were very encouraging of, listen to what it is that you are gifted in and do that. That is what God calls you to be in the world. God doesn't call you to be a mini us. God calls you to use the gift that God has specifically given you and to use it in a way to uplift your fellow human beings. And what that gift is, that you will discover as you grow and as you listen to your teachers and as you pay attention to the word that you hear in church, as you listen to your elders in our community teaching about our culture, it will be clear to you what it is that God is calling you to be and do in the world.
Now, we were all so saddened to hear and just to experience your father's passing. Well, it was a difficult time for the world. And you spoke about his influence in your life, that he was simply daddy to you. What do you think father's greatest lesson that we still need to learn?
I would say that the greatest lesson, particularly for us people of Africa and the African diaspora was that God did not make a mistake when he made us African, Black, a woman. I mean, that those are not mistakes, that is who God needed us to be in God's world. And that the gifts and the struggles of our people should be what we use to catapult the next generation into achieving the dreams of our ancestors. That I think that what we, as again, particularly as people of Africa and the African diaspora, have been a people whom the world has tried to tell that we are less than, that we are not quite made in God's image the way that other people are. And the lesson that my father taught us is that we are in God's image, that we as African people, we as Black people, we as Black women are definitely made in God's image. And funnily enough, I was having this conversation with a friend today, and I was saying, you know, one of the things that my father taught me in my faith is that, you know, if I say that I'm made in the image of God, that means that there is God who is a Black woman. There is God who is a Black woman. And that, you know, the difference is that when I say that, I am not saying that God is only a Black woman, which is what the Europeans tried to tell us when they brought Christianity, that God is only a white man. But our faith is that God, when God looks at me, God sees God's self. When God looks at any of God's children, God sees God's self. And so the lesson I think that we need to hold on to is the fact that Imago Dei is not something about white people. It is not something about men. It is about us. We are God carriers as we are. There is nothing that we need to change about our physical appearance, about our culture, about our heritage to make us more godlike. We are God's image as we are.
So it's so interesting to hear you say that. Like that really excites me, that when God looks at me, God sees themselves in
God's
me.
self. Exactly.
God's self that is in me. When I visited South Africa, and it was in 1993, so 3 years after, of course, apartheid, I was in Joburg, I was in Ekenhoek, and I said, wow, I'm in a place that when I think about the struggles of Black folks in America, I said, I see some similarities. I said, the way I was mistreated at home, the color of my skin, before they hear me speak and know that I'm from America, I'm getting the same mistreatment. So can you talk about some of those similarities? Because maybe people need to understand that the struggle around Blackness isn't just happening in America. It's happening beyond our borders too.
It's happening all over the world. And I tell people that, you know, the experiences that I experienced of racism might be slightly different. What I experienced in England, as opposed to what I experienced in France, as opposed to what I experienced in the US, as opposed to what I experienced in South Africa. But the fundamental issue of racism, of structural white supremacy, is the same structure, upholding white supremacy and questioning the worth of particularly Black people. So, I mean, I think that, you know, when we talk about white supremacy, yes, there is a white supremacy that questions the worth of all people of color, right? No matter who we are. But there's a specific anti-Black racism that is pervasive and that we might experience in different ways. So I love to tell the stories of, you know, when my dad was the General Secretary of the South African Council of Churches, we would often have visitors from the US, Black Americans during apartheid. And during apartheid, you know, because of the importance of economic relations with the US, African Americans were classified in South Africa as honorary white. So once, as you say, once you start speaking and they recognize that you do not speak like a South African, then under apartheid, you were classified as honorary white. And our role as my dad's family was, when we would have these visitors, we would be the ones who would take them shopping and, you know, to get whatever they needed, whether it was souvenirs or just the regular grocery shopping that we would do. And over, white South Africans would say to them, well, you know, you're not like our Blacks, you know, so that's how come we can treat you differently. You are educated, you are, you know, what, you're different. And they would say that, you know, right in front of me, who was one of their so-called Blacks, right? And then I came to the US and that script was flipped, right? And so I would have white Americans basically saying to me, you are different, you are exotic, you are African, you're not an African American. And even raising my children in the US, I would have teachers, because my children have African names, who would say to me, well, you know, your children are not like African. I know, like, my children are African American. My children are raised in this country. This is who they are. And just because their names are African, you're not going to pretend that you are going to treat them differently. Because at the end, your judgment of my children is still based on their race. And you might think that you are buying my face, as they say in South Africa, by saying that as an African, I am somehow different from African American. I told them, I've had the flip happen to me, so I'm not going to buy into that little story that you're giving. And so I think that one of the most powerful things of racism is this ability to make the victims of racism think that there is something that we can do that will make us acceptable in the sight of racism. That there is something that I can speak with a South African accent in Kentucky, and therefore I will be protected from racism. As you said, until you open your mouth, how are they to know that you're not South African? And the reality of their anti-Black racism gets shown. And if we buy into this thing that there is a way that we can escape racism by saying, oh, I am not one of your Blacks. What the heck is that? I mean, what does that even mean? So for me, that there were very different, well, not even very, but yes, very different experiences of how racism impacted me in different places. But the fundamental structure of white supremacy racism is the same. It is the same, and it is at our peril that we buy into a thing that, whether it is respectability politics, saying, you know, if you take the do-rag off, or if you don't wear a hoodie, or if you are educated, you will be protected from racism. Over and over, we have seen that isn't true. And so for us to try and mitigate racism by changing the ways in which we speak or walk or take up space has not saved our people's lives in all these generations. So why do we think that it's going to do so now?
I often think that when we start talking about race relations, just thinking about Black people in America, that this belief, the lie that you are the minority, that you're the minority in this country, rather than helping Black folks in America to understand we might have the minority numbers here in this country. We are not the minority when you start talking about Black people
globally
all over the planet. Like when you think about connecting our numbers to Black folks that were slung down into South America, that were the Black on the continent, not the country of Africa, the continent of Africa. It will change your thinking. So you know what, then I'm not the minority. I'm the majority. And that shift removes you from being a victim to saying, no, I'm actually a victor when I think about where we stand and our footing.
Right. And what we have been through.
Yes.
Where our ancestors, what our ancestors went through to put us where we are. And you know, the reality is, if you look at the 50s and 60s and the Pan-African movement at that time, that was so clear to our leaders all over the world that, you know, when you look at those Pan-Africanist congresses that happened, that brought together people from the African continent, people from the US, people from Europe, people from the Caribbean, that our leaders, our thinkers at that time were saying our struggle is the same struggle. It might be a struggle for independence on the continent. It might be a struggle for independence in the Caribbean. It might be a struggle for civil, human, and voting rights in the US, but the fundamentals of the struggle are the same. We are struggling for our human dignity to be recognized. We are struggling for our liberty, no matter what the actual, the mechanism that we're talking about. The fundamental thing we're struggling for is our liberty and our humanity to be recognized around the world. And the separating that has happened about our struggles subsequently is not a mistake. It is not a mistake that we have been taught to be suspicious of one another. It is not a mistake that we have been taught that African history has got nothing to do with African Americans, that what happens in England should not be of our concern in South Africa. That separation of our struggles has made us look at our struggles in isolation and not put together the strength that we have as a united people across the globe.
And that was intentional, right? So if you start thinking about tenets of white supremacy, what had to be dismantled was the Pan-African movement. You have to have folks isolated to make them believe that there is no way out of this.
Right.
Now, I want you to talk about the work that you did in setting up the Tutu Foundation for Development and Relief. And the importance of that work. I know you're no longer the chairperson. You're talking, 1985 and 1990, but that work has continued with that foundation.
Well, the foundation itself actually hasn't continued. The work has continued in some of the other Tutu entities around the world. But at that point, my passion was about South African refugees in African countries. And at that time, we had so many young people had fled apartheid South Africa and were living in countries like Botswana, Swaziland, Lesotho, Tanzania, Zambia. And the idea behind that foundation was that we empower those refugees in those countries so that they are starting businesses, so that they are educating themselves, so that they are investing in their upskilling of their community, so that they are contributing to the countries where they are refugees, but also that they are preparing themselves for a free South Africa, right? So the work of the foundation was primarily in African countries. And it was giving scholarships, it was supplying books, it was supplying funding for businesses. It was doing basic things like mosquito nets for refugees in Tanzania, where, South Africans coming from South Africa, malaria had not been an issue in South Africa. And so all of a sudden you're a refugee in Tanzania where malaria is a big issue, and just the basics of having mosquito nets is not something that you think of as you're fleeing the country. You're not thinking, oh, I better go and buy some mosquito nets before I leave this political oppression. And so we at the foundation were working specifically with South African refugees in African countries. Subsequently, as apartheid ended and South African refugees came back home, some of the Tutu named entities continued the focus on young people, on empowering young people through education, through employment skills, through mentoring, through encouraging their leadership in organizations. That work has continued inside South Africa, but not the foundation itself.
One of the things I think about, because I think about South Africa, just to let you know, every day. It's when I was there, the man who hosted us, his name was Jeff Mpakafa. And when we were leaving South Africa, he said, I have a gift to give to you. He said, but it's very important to me that you hold on to this. And he gave me his sister's passbook. And I know that
wow,
so many people threw the passbooks into the fire. So inside it has the big stamp where it says deceased. He said, but my sister always wanted to go to America.
Oh,
so I want to send her with you. So that's framed and that hangs on my wall. And I remember when my sons were growing up, I would say, no. When you walk past here, understand that we are all connected. She never made it to America. I made it to South Africa and I bought a piece of her bag. Can you talk about why it's important for us to understand that when we come in contact with people, we take a little piece of them and we leave a little piece of ourselves behind?
Definitely. I mean, and again, that is the whole concept of Ubuntu, right? That who we are is so much a part of all the people who have had a role in our lives. And some of the roles are huge. The people who parented us, the people who taught us. Some of them might seem small, right? The person who you meet one day and just says to you, you're beautiful, and keeps on walking. And that seems like that is such a small thing, but that person has poured something into us. So that is so much what the concept of Ubuntu is that we recognize that who we are, where we are, is so much all of the people who have poured something into us, and therefore encourages us, therefore, to be cognizant of what it is we pour into other people's lives. Are we pouring strength? Are we pouring healing? Are we pouring compassion? Or are we pouring disdain? Are we pouring contempt? So that, and it is so easy to make a choice at any given time. And as I said earlier, I am somebody who there are times where I'm like, I am not about to be a good human being today. I am tired. Y'all have got me up to here. I'm not, this is not the day for me to be good. But I always go back to, but this is not who you were raised to be. How you were raised to be, and not only by my parents, but by the culture that we grew up in, that it was a respect of elders, but it was a respect of elders because elders respected children too, and looked upon children as their own, and cared about the well-being of any child that they interacted with. and so that idea that who we are is a sum total of all those who have poured into us, and those whom we interact with, therefore, are receiving something from us. And therefore, we have to be cognizant and pay attention always as to what it is we are pouring into the lives of those we interact with.
Reverend Tutu, educator and human rights activist, founded the Tutu Foundation for Development and Relief, served as its chairperson from 1985 to 1990. She also selected the writings for and wrote the introduction to the book, The Words of Desmond Tutu. You'll be speaking at the inaugural Black History Month convocation taking place on Wednesday, February 16th at McDaniel College. My last question for you. Okay, so your father had such an impact on all of us and on me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about his legacy. I want you to go ahead a little bit. How do you want to be remembered? What do you want people to say about you when your journey here is done?
Well, I hope that they will say that I too was a troublemaker for places of injustice, that I too was somebody who used the platform that I have been given to challenge us to be better people in the world, that I was somebody who encouraged those who come behind me to recognize their infinite worth and value, that I was somebody who, like my father, I hope, has a sense of humor and is able to use humor to heal, and that I am somebody, I hope that people will speak of me as somebody who too has been passionate for justice and equality.
Reverend Tutu, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.